Two very important methods we're going to need is get next lesson and get previous lesson. So we should have these methods on our lesson class, and it should be really useful when we want to maybe automatically redirect the user to the next lesson he wants to watch, or we want to display the next and previous buttons on the watching page, okay, maybe under the player or something like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and take care of this. We would actually use a test to test drive this. So I'm gonna create a new test, PHP artisan make test, and this would be the lesson test, and I'll specify that it's unit. Okay, so head over to our lesson test and we'll create our first test. This would be public function test can get next and previous lessons from a lesson. Okay, so how do we organize this? Given that we have a series of lessons, we'll call the get next lesson and get previous lesson methods, and then we'll run some assertions. So when we are creating these series lessons, we are going to organize them in a particular way, call these methods and run the assertions. Okay, so let's dive into this. First, I'm just going to use broadcast series and broadcast lesson. Then right here, what I'll do is I'll say lesson, or I'll just head over to my series test actually, and then I'm just gonna copy this, okay, because this is exactly what we need. Then back to my lesson test, I'll just paste this in. So I'm precising lesson has episode number of 200, lesson 2 has episode number of 100, and lesson 3 has episode number of 300. Therefore, actually lesson 2 is the first to play, then this one plays, and then this one plays. That's how it's supposed to be. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll call next lesson method. So next lesson equals lesson get next lesson. Okay, so we are calling get next lesson on this one, and this is episode 200, therefore the next lesson should be episode 300 right here. Okay, so let's run an assertion. This assert equals next lesson ID, and this should be equal to lesson 3 ID, right? Then we can say this assert equals get previous lesson, and we'll get the ID. So it looks like we don't even need this variable right here. I'll just pull it out. Okay, so assert equals get next lesson ID for lesson 3, and if we are calling lesson 3, which is this one, and we are getting the previous lesson, then it should be this one, right? So we'll say assert that the ID equals lesson ID. Okay, so let's also call lesson 2. So assert equals lesson 2 get next lesson ID. So this is lesson 2. Therefore, if we get the next lesson, it should be this one, right? So if we get the next lesson, we should assert that it equals lesson ID. And then we should also get assert equals lesson 2. So what if we get the previous lesson, even though we know this one is actually the first lesson, right? It means we are expecting that lesson 2, which is the first. If we get previous lesson, we should expect null. Therefore, I'm going to change this to assert null, that get previous lesson returns to us null. And it's very important that you actually return null and not an error, okay? Because if your implementation breaks your code, then it's really dangerous. So if it returns null, then what we can do in our view is check if this is not null, then display the get previous lesson button, or if it's not null, then display the get next button, something like that. Okay, so if your implementation actually breaks, if it doesn't find a previous lesson or next lesson, then it's not a really good implementation, because you need to start handling errors and all that. Okay, so let's also assert that when we get the last lesson, which is lesson 3, and we try to get next lesson, it also gives us null. Okay, so I think we've run a bunch of assertions right here, and I think it's really going to guide us in making this method pass. Okay, so let's run it. PHP unit filter by this test. Great, call to undefined method get next lessons. So we'll head over to our lesson.php and we'll create that method get next lessons. Run that test again. trying to get property of known object. Why? Because this first test, it's getting get next lesson, which returns null at the moment, and we're trying to get the ID. Okay, so let's just work on this method to make sure that it passes. First, we know the series that this lesson belongs to. Okay, so what we can do is we'll say this series, and we'll get all the lessons for this series such that we know that we have reduced all our database records to the lessons that concern this particular series, and then we would search this series where the episode number is greater than this episode number. And once we get only the lessons where the episode number is greater than this episode number, we are going to order the results. So order by the episode number field in ascending order, and finally we would get the first result. Okay, so get the series so that you get all the lessons that are only in this series, and then you search where the episode number is greater than this one, and if it's greater, then you order in ascending order such that the next would be at the very top, and then you get the first. Okay, so let's run this, and we still get this trying to get property of known object error. Okay, let's try to debug together. We have this series lessons, and this is supposed to return to us a collection of all the lessons that belong to the series that this lesson belongs to, which is 3 in this case. Yeah, and then we get where the episode number is greater than this episode number, and in this case it should return only this one because that's the only one that passes that condition, right? And then it should order in ascending order just in case we have more than one, and then it should return to us the first result. Okay, it's supposed to succeed, but for some reason it's not. So I'll show you how I debug in these cases. So right here I know it's returning null. Then what I'm gonna do is, for every single step of this, I'm gonna try to debug at a certain point. Okay, so for example, this series lessons, I'm gonna just die-dump the result of that operation to make sure that it gives me what I expect. Okay, so rather than calling this, I'm just gonna call the property so I get all, and if I run that, it gives me an array of 1 element rather than 3 that we created. And if we check out the series ID, it's giving us a series ID of 11. And I think I know why this is, because every time we run a test, it's going to create a new series, create new lessons, because we are not refreshing our database. Okay, found it. So we need to refresh our database such that we have fresh data every time we run our test. Okay, so I'll remove this die-dump right here, run that test one more time, and we have call to undefined method get previous lesson. Great, which means our get next lesson works as expected. Okay, so let's create this get previous lesson method, which is going to be public function get previous lesson. And what do? Let's return this series lessons, and remember we are scoping to only the lessons for this series because we can do something like self where, but this is going to give us all lesson records in the database, and then we can't be comparing the episode numbers because they're gonna get mixed up. Remember, the episode numbers can be duplicated and they also belong to different series. So we get only for this series, and we use the brackets right here because we need a query builder instance, and I'm not so sure if we need it because remember, on collections we have where methods, we have where in methods, and in this case if we use this we actually have an instance of Illuminate database eloquent collection. Well, I'm gonna leave that to you to find out, but I'm just gonna stick to the braces, and then I'm gonna call my where method. The episode number is less than this episode number, and this is gonna give us a list of all the lessons whose episode numbers are less than the one that we are checking, and then we can order by episode number because now by default they are ordered by their IDs. So we'll get order by episode number, and we'll put that in a star, and we'll get the last. Okay, so I'm not so sure about that, but let's walk through it together. If we have 1, 4, 3, 5, 6, and we are working with ID of 5. Therefore, when we run this query, it's going to give us 1 and 3. And if we order in ascending order, we're going to have 1 and 3. And the previous is supposed to be 3. So I think getting the last is the reasonable choice. Okay, so let's run this, and our test is going to tell us if we're right or not. Okay, it says call to undefined method on the query builder last. Okay, so we're working with the query builder here and not the collection. Therefore, we can't call last. But what we can do is order this in descending order and still call our first method. Okay, so let's run that test one more time. And great, we're green, so we're successfully getting the next and previous lessons. Now, how are we going to use this? In our watch.blade.php, we can now comfortably have a next button and a previous button under the player so that the user can watch the next lesson or can also go back to the previous lesson. We'll talk about that more in the next lesson.